Hello and welcome to this special evening with Christopher Paolini, presented by the Melbourne Writers Festival Schools Program and the Wheeler Centre. I'd like to thank Random House Australia and Dymocks Collins Street for making this evening possible. And thank you for coming out on a rather damp evening. At the very least, we've given Christopher a true picture of Melbourne in winter. My name's Mike Shuttleworth. I'm the Program Manager for the Melbourne Writers Festival. Well, last year I managed a high school library, a school of about 800 students, lots of keen readers. But no book was more keenly anticipated or hotly seized upon than Inheritance, the fourth and final book of this epic story cycle. Not one. And we bought a lot of books in a year. In Australia, Inheritance was a #1 selling book, and sales for the series has topped 35 million copies. They've been translated into 49 languages, I believe, which I think is even more impressive. But what really matters is not sales charts, but the pull that a story exerts on the reader. And Christopher Paolini has been exerting a fierce grip on readers since Eragon first appeared nearly 10 years ago. The stories are broad in their scope and thrilling in their scale and imagination. And tonight we're here to celebrate the Inheritance series, a remarkable feat of storytelling, books that will be read with excitement and pleasure for years and years to come. And we're here to celebrate the author. Please welcome Christopher Paolini.
Well, thank you for that wonderful welcome, and I want to thank everyone for having me here and for that lovely introduction. This is actually my very first time in Australia and my very first time in Melbourne, and I got to say it's a real treat to be here. Some of you may know I started writing Eragon all the way back in 1998 when I was 15, and I just finished the last book, Inheritance, little under a year ago. And when I finished it, I had been working on the Inheritance cycle for just about 14 years, which was exactly half my life at that point. So, it's really exciting to have the series be done and to be able to come out here and talk to you about the thing as a whole, and to know that people can finally read the series and see the entirety of it in a way that no one has been able to do except for me for many, many years. And it's a little bittersweet to be saying goodbye to this series, but at the same time it's also exciting to be looking forward to new projects and new stories. And so tonight what I want to do is I want to tell you guys a little bit about how I got into reading and writing, how I wrote the Inheritance cycle, at least a little bit about that, and then hopefully I can answer every single question you've got, or at least make a good attempt at it. And if I bore you at any point along the way, let me know and I'll do handstands up here instead. I may fall over, but I'll make a good attempt at it. So, you see me up here today as a published author. And you may think to yourself, oh, well, he's a writer. He's always enjoyed reading and writing. Well, the truth of it is, when I was really young, and my mom was teaching me how to read, because I was homeschooled my whole life. And so my mom was my teacher, along with my dad, but, mainly it was my mom. I think my dad worked more in the capacity of a principal. So if I did something really bad, I had to go see Dad. But when my mom was teaching me how to read, I absolutely hated it. In fact, I went up to her one time. I marched up to her and I said, "I hate to read. I'm never going to use it the rest of my life." Fortunately for me, she didn't listen to me. And she kept teaching me. And then one day, she took me to the public library where we were living, which was in Anchorage, Alaska at that time. And Alaska is kind of a neat place because, in the summertime, the sun stays up in the sky for so long that we had our neighbors outside mowing their lawns at midnight because there was still light. And they have a different species of mosquito up in Alaska. They're about that big. And they chase you in giant black swarms that you can hear like the hum of attack helicopters. These giant black swarms will chase you down, and if they catch you, they will suck every last drop of blood out of your body and leave nothing behind but a desiccated corpse. Nice place, though. So anyway, we went to the library, and I was wandering around in the children's section. And as I wandered around in the children's section, I found this series of really thin detective novels, children's detective novels. And I didn't really know what they were about, but they had bright covers and interesting titles. So I pulled one off the shelf, and I checked it out. And it was the very first book I'd ever checked out on my own. Sorry, the interruption, and then jet lag takes over. Yesterday I was in Hobart, getting to see Tasmanian devils, and I got taken down along the coast, and I sailed past the Black Coast and Grief Gulch and the Isle of the Dead, and then I listened to the howling of the devils. Australia is awesome. In any case, back to the story. So I didn't know what the books were about, but they interested me, checked them out. First book I ever checked out on my own. Not the first book I had ever read. The first book I ever read was Green Eggs and Ham by the immortal Dr Seuss. And I was forced, at spear point almost, to read this out loud in front of my family to prove that I now knew what the letters and the words meant. And this was a rite of passage that I can only equate to walking barefoot over a field of coals while being chased by a horde of angry orcs without any clothes on. Me, not the orcs. So I wasn't really a fan of the whole reading thing. And I took this book home with me, and I opened it up. And for whatever reason, at that moment, it was as if a switch just got flipped inside of my head. And instead of just seeing the words on the page, I could see the things that they were supposed to represent. So instead of seeing the word for sunset, I could actually see a sunset in my head. I could hear what the characters were saying. I could smell the locations. And from that moment on, I just completely fell in love with reading. And unfortunately, I don't remember the name of that book anymore, but I do remember that the story involved tomato sauce being mistaken for blood, which seemed really, really exciting to me when I was 5 years old. And I really do believe, though, that the ability of writing to transport us to other places and to let us get inside other people's heads and experience things that we could never otherwise experience, I really believe that that's the closest thing we have to true magic in the world today. And words are incredibly powerful. We've all heard phrases that have changed us or have changed the world. Phrases like, to be or not to be, that is the question, from Shakespeare. Or one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, by Neil Armstrong. And those are just small examples among many, many others. So I love reading, and I think it's incredibly important, obviously. And I read as much as I could growing up. I always would go to the library and bring back piles of books and devour them. And I read so much that at a certain point, my parents, normally parents are coming to you and saying, you should read more, you should read more. No, my parents came to me and they said, Christopher, we're really happy you're reading, but we think you should pay a little bit more attention to the world around you. And I said, no, why? I know what's going on. And they said, yes, but we've been talking to you for 15 minutes. And you haven't heard us until now. So I did, as I said, I became rather obsessive with the reading. And eventually I graduated from high school. I graduated at 15, mainly the result of not taking any summer breaks my entire life. Thank you, Mom. Actually, my sister was determined to beat me, and she actually graduated at 14. So, you know, she beat me. She did beat me. I didn't realize it was a race until it was too late. But when I graduated, my very first thought was, you know, no more school. This is going to be awesome. And it was awesome for about 2 weeks. And then I got really, 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 really bored. I got so bored that I went into our backyard and I started digging a hole. And it was a big hole, too. It was about, it ended up being about 2 meters across, about 2 meters deep, and it was circular. And then we had one of those big old satellite dishes that you used to see everywhere, and it was abandoned on our property. So I took the satellite dish, and I dragged it over to the hole, and I tipped it over the hole so that the dish formed a roof for the hole. And then I took a bunch of hay bales, because I live in Montana, and there are a lot of hay bales in Montana, and I piled the hay bales on top of the satellite dish for insulation, and then I ripped bark off of dead trees and used the bark to make shingles on top of the hay bales, on top of the satellite dish, on top of the hole. Now you might be wondering, with all that stuff on top of the hole, how I actually got into the hole. Well, I dug a tunnel into the hole. And then I built an entryway for the tunnel. And then I started chopping down dead trees along the nearby river, chopping them down with a hammer, I might add. And then I dragged the logs up in front of the entryway, and I planted them upright in the ground to form the framework for what was going to be a Viking-style Mead Hall. Now, when you start digging giant holes and building Viking-style mead halls in your backyard, you are officially bored. And I realized that I had to do something else with myself aside from digging holes, as much as I enjoyed that. And the thing is I didn't have to do anything. You know, I wasn't in school, I didn't have a job, and the nearest town was over a half hour away, and I didn't drive back then. So I didn't have to do anything, and no one was forcing me to do anything. And I think that everyone ought to have that experience at least once in your life, where no one's forcing you to do anything. And whatever it is you choose to do in that time, you know, whether it's digging giant holes, or playing video games, or making video games, or, you know, math or science, or fiddling with machines, or just even being with other people. Whatever it is you choose to do in that time, that's probably what you should pursue as a career. And in my case, I decided that I wanted to try writing the sort of story that I would enjoy myself and that I had enjoyed growing up. And since I loved reading fantasy, you know, I thought, oh man, you know, I'm going to take all the things I love about fantasy and try to combine them into one book. So I'm going to have the magic sword and the wise old mentor and the evil villain and the dragons and the elves and the dwarves and, you know, all the good stuff, right? And put it into one book and see what happens. And so I ended up spending about a month and a half, working out the story for the inheritance cycle. And once I felt like I had a good idea of what was going to happen in each of the books, I would say each of the 3 books, since back then I thought it was a trilogy, but I just say that the series is a trilogy in 4 parts. So let's put it that way. Once I knew what was going to happen generally in the books, and quite specifically in the first book, that's when I finally sat down and actually started writing Aragon. And it was a lot of fun to write the book. I just sort of raced through the first draft. And when I finished, I went back to the beginning and I read it through for the first time. And I was really excited. You know, I get to read my own book for the first time. It was horrible. It was awful. The story was there, but the writing itself needed a lot of help. And just to give you an idea of just how bad it was, I'm a little ashamed to admit this, but in the very first draft of Aragon, Aragon wasn't named Aragon. Kevin! Aragon was named Kevin. Which, by the way, if any of you are named Kevin, it's a great name. I love the name. But I don't think the series would have been half so popular if it had been about the adventures of the great dragon rider, Kevin. There was also a unicorn involved at one point in the story, which is even worse. So I said, okay, I'm going to try to fix this. And I rewrote the book. I changed Kevin to Aragon and removed the unicorn. I also added in the character of Angela the herbalist, whom some of you may know I actually based on my sister, Angela. And yes, that is what she's like. And fortunately for me, she has a very good sense of humor about it, or else I wouldn't be standing here right now. And in fact, side note, again, for those of you who've already read Aragon, the argument about frogs and toads that she gets into in the book, that's a real argument my sister had with an uncle of mine. And for the record, the answer is that all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. This is important. Once I finished the rewrite of Aragon, I gave the book to my parents. They read it, and fortunately for me, they liked what they read. And so as a family, we decided we were going to self-publish the book, take it out into the world, and see what people thought of it. And that's exactly what we did. I ended up traveling all across the western half of the United States doing events for the self-published book. Events quite like this, actually. Although back then, I did all of my events while dressed in a medieval costume. And the idea was to get attention for the series. And it was a cool costume, too. It was black, knee-high, lace-up leather boots, billowy black pantaloons, a big black pirate belt, billowy red swordsman shirt, and a black beret to top it off. Now, the very first event I ever did, the very first presentation I ever did, was in our local high school. Now, keep in mind, I was 17. I'd been homeschooled my entire life. I had never set foot in a public school before. And I walked into the school dressed like that. And when I got into the library where my event was being held, from the back of the room, I heard some guy say, he said, "Hello, Romeo." As you can see, I don't wear that costume anymore. But I had a lot of fun, and eventually, of course, Random House caught wind of the book, and they caught wind of it because another author, an author by the name of Carl Hyacin, he wrote a young adult book called Hoot, which some of you may have heard of, but he came up to Montana for vacation, and he bought a copy of the self-published edition of Aragon for his then 12-year-old son, Ryan. And Ryan read the book, and he liked the book, and most importantly, he said that he liked the book. And as a result, Carl then passed the book on to Random House. But I love telling this story because to me it really illustrates the power of readers, then especially young readers, because if Ryan hadn't read Aragon, and if he hadn't liked it, and if he hadn't spoken about it and said that he liked it, Random House wouldn't have published the book, and millions of readers around the world wouldn't have gotten a chance to experience the story, and you guys wouldn't be sitting here today, I wouldn't be standing here today, and quite a few things would be different. So, I'm very grateful to that, and I always like to give a shout out to Ryan because, I definitely owe him one for that. Of course, once Random House got the book, I then wrote Eldest and Brissinger, and now finally the fourth and final book, Inheritance. And with each of the books, I've had some great experiences taking them around and meeting people. For example, right before I was supposed to go on tour for Eldest, I was at home and I was preparing for my book tour. Well, I was supposed to be preparing for my book tour. I was actually playing video games. I was playing a game called Jedi Knight Academy 2, which was an awesome game. And you could fight people in it with lightsabers, which, is the goal of everyone in life, right? To be in a real lightsaber fight. And so I was playing the game, and I was logged into the internet, dueling people from all around the world. And while I was doing this, someone logged into the level using the name Aragon. And I said to myself, oh, I've got to fight this guy. So, I went over and I challenged him to a fight, and he accepted. And the horrible thing is, he was better than me. And he beat me. And across the screen it said, "You have been killed by Aragon." I didn't need to see that. And then with the third book, I was in the States on tour in Chicago, and it was actually at a theater, very much like this. And during the signing, a young woman came through the signing line, and on her arm, she was carrying a sugar glider. Now, for those of you who may not know, sugar gliders are somewhat like flying squirrels, except they're marsupials, and they have very, very large eyes, and they're very, 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 very cute. So I looked at the woman and I said, "Well, that's an interesting animal. Do you mind if I pet it?" And she said, "Oh, sure, go right ahead. He loves strangers." You can just see where this is going, can't you? So I reached out and I started petting the sugar glider, and it looked up at me. And then it took its hands, because they have hands like a raccoon, and it wrapped its fingers around my finger. And then ever so politely, just ever so politely, it began to gnaw on my finger. And I was sitting there, and there was blood running down my hand. And I was looking at the woman and saying, "Will you please stop your pet from trying to eat me?" But I'm kind of glad it happened, because I'm now one of the few people outside of Australia who can say that I have been chewed on by a marsupial. Which I think ought to be, it's some kind of achievement in life. It ought to be an achievement on the Xbox, chewed on by a marsupial, 200 points. And then with Inheritance, with the last book, during the last bit of work on the editing and stuff, I was in New York City at the Random House headquarters. And during the last week of work on the fourth book, and on the series as a whole, during that last week, New York City got hit by both an earthquake and a hurricane. And my editor came to me and she said, "Christopher, I love you dearly, but you really, really, really have to finish this series before any more natural disasters occur." So finish it I did, and again, I'm very excited to be out and talking about it. And there's something I want to do now that I've actually wanted to do ever since Aragon came out, but it's only become possible in the last few months. And what I want to do is I want to read you guys a very short excerpt from each of the 4 books. Do you want to hear that? Yeah? Now, as you may notice, I don't actually have any books up here with me, and while I could probably do this from memory, I'd rather not try. So, who has a copy of Aragon that I can borrow? If you've got one, bring it up. Whoever gets here first wins. And we have a winner! Okay. Now, as I said, this is a very, very, very brief excerpt. I'm going to read you the very first line of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Inheritance Cycle. So, here goes. Hope you enjoy. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. There you go. Thank you. Told you it'd be short. All right, who's got eldest? You've got... All right. Hey, he's in the front row. I will give the book back, I promise. I have a few copies of it myself. In Russian, no less. I can't read it, but it's fun to look at. Okay, so as some of you may know, one of the things I did with the Inheritance Cycle is I created a couple of imaginary languages for the books, which I enjoyed doing quite a lot. And the main language, of course, is the elf language, the ancient language. And I want to read you a blessing, an elvish blessing in this language. Now, I based the language partly off of Old Norse, which I think gives it a nice sound and feel. However, I have an absolutely horrendous elvish accent. And that's because in the ancient language, you're supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue the way you might in Spanish or Italian. And I can't do that. The only way I can roll my R's, and I apologize because I know this sounds horribly obscene, but the only way I can roll my R's is by wiggling my uvula. That's the thing in the back of your throat. So, I'm going to wiggle my uvula at you guys. And I hope you like it, too. Atra sterni onothelduin, maranor lief uninjarta onner, undu everinia onovarda. Now that said, it really, of all the languages I invented, the dwarf language is definitely my favorite. And that's because I came up with it from scratch, and it has a really meaty sound to it. You can just sink your teeth into it. So here's a chunk of Dwarvish, and unlike the ancient language, I have an excellent Dwarvish accent. And that's because in Dwarvish you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. So, let the wiggling commence. Form Vrethkarach, Form Jürgen Karmiter, Noseta Grof Bastarnag, Dur Incesti Rakithen, Jok Iswarv Aj Barzuligor, Dur Durgrimst Aj Schwelden Rak Anuin, Bog Tor Rak, Jürgen Vren. Thank you. All right, you came up with Brissinger. As you might guess, dwarves are usually very hoarse, and no one much likes listening to their love poems. Okay. Except maybe Tasmanian devils. Now, as you might have noticed, Brissinger, the third book, is a rather large book. And like most large books, it has a lot of sentences in it. And I'm actually, a little bit more fond of some of those sentences compared with some of the other ones. There's one, for example, that involves a bombulating bumblebee, which I probably should have cut, but I was just a little bit too fond of it, so I left it in. But in any case, among all the many, many sentences that make up this very large book, there's one in particular that is my absolute favorite. And I just think it's a particularly well-written sentence. I think it has a lot of literary merit. And so I'm going to read you my favorite sentence. I hope you enjoy it. You ready to hear it? Yeah. Ready to hear? Okay, here it goes. Die, puny human! Thank you. Oh, you bent the cover. Okay. I'm going to swap back. Sorry. He bent his cover. I mean, really, what's the point of writing fantasy if you can't write lines like, die, puny human, every now and then? I'll write something special in your book. I'll make up for it. Okay. So, this looks like a well-loved copy, the best kind. So, last book. I'm going to read you a little bit longer piece now. This is, and if you haven't read the fourth book, don't worry, no spoilers. Well, nothing big. In any case, I'm going to read you from the very end of the very first chapter of the very last book of the Inheritance Cycle. Here goes. The sound was stabbing, slicing, shivering, like metal scraping against stone. Aragorn's teeth vibrated in sympathy, and he covered his ears with his hands, grimacing as he twisted around, trying to locate the source of the noise. Saphira tossed her head, and even through the din, he heard her whine in distress. Aragorn swept his gaze over the courtyard 2 separate times before he noticed a faint puff of dust rising up the wall of the keep from a foot-wide crack that had appeared beneath the blackened, partially destroyed window where Blodgarm had killed the magician. As the squeal increased in intensity, Aragorn risked lifting one of his hands off his ears to point at the crack. "Look!" he shouted to Arya, who nodded in acknowledgement. He replaced his hand over his ear. Without warning or preamble, the sound stopped. Aragorn waited for a moment, then slowly lowered his hands, for once wishing that his hearing was not quite so sensitive. Just as he did, the crack jerked open wider, spreading until it was several feet across, and raced down the wall of the keep. Like a bolt of lightning, the crack struck and shattered the keystone above the doors to the building, showering the floor below with pebbles. The whole castle groaned, and from the damaged window to the broken keystone, the front of the keep began to lean outward. "Run!" Aragon shouted at the Varden, though the men were already scattering to either side of the courtyard, desperate to get out from under the precarious wall. Aragon took a single step forward, every muscle in his body tense, as he searched for a glimpse of Roran somewhere in the throng of warriors. At last, Aragon spotted him, trapped behind the last group of men by the doorway, bellowing madly at them, his words lost in the commotion. Then the wall shifted and dropped several inches, leaning even further away from the rest of the building, pelting Roran with rocks, knocking him off balance, and forcing him to stumble backward under the overhang of the doorway. As Roran straightened from a crouch, his eyes met Aragon's, and in his gaze, Aragon saw a flash of fear and helplessness, quickly followed by resignation, as if Roran knew that no matter how fast he ran, he could not possibly reach safety in time. A wry smile touched Roran's lips, and the wall fell. Thank you. Does he live? Does he die? Read chapter 2. I'd love to try to answer as many of your questions as I can now. However, I do ask you that if you've read any of the books, please keep in mind there may be some people here who haven't. So let's try not to tell them who lives or who dies. We'll leave that for the internet comments. So, who has a question, and what would you like to know about the author? And we have some mics here that we'll get around. Yes.
You said that after you wrote your first book, you went back and read it and didn't think it was very good. How did you go about making your writing better at that age?
That is a great question. How do you go about making your writing better? Well, as with many aspects of writing, a comparison with music is very apt. When you sing, it's very hard sometimes to hear when you hit a bad note. And the best way to become a better singer is to have someone else listen to you, someone who knows what they're doing, and tell you when you're hitting the bad notes. And with writing, the equivalent of that is editing. So what you do is you write something, and the thing is, you're too close to it as the author. You don't know what you've done wrong sometimes. So you get someone else who's a good reader to look at your work and tell you when they think you're hitting bad notes. And you just do that over and over and over again, and eventually you stop hitting quite so many bad notes. In my case, I was fortunate that my parents were both very good readers and could help do that for me. And then, of course, once I started working with Random House, I started working with my current editor, Michelle, who has done a great deal to help teach me more about writing and, of course, to improve the quality of the series as a whole. Long answer to a short question.
When the movie came out, what did you think? Did you think it was good, or did you think they could have done better on doing it since it was your book?
I knew someone was going to ask that. I'm very happy that a movie was made, because very few books are ever made into movies, and the movie introduced a lot of new readers to the series, which I think is a good thing. I gave as much input as I could into the making of the movie, but ultimately the film reflected the studio and the director's vision of the story, just as the books reflected my vision of the story. And I think everyone's free to enjoy them on their own terms. I don't know if there are going to be more films. I certainly hope so. The first movie made money, so there's no real reason not to make more. Although I think at this point they'd have to recast all the roles and stuff, and probably the best thing to do would just be to remake the first film. Given that you'd have to have all new actors, you might as well remake the first film. But the decision as to whether or not to do that is up to the studio right now. So if you'd like to see some more movies, write them a letter. It's 20th Century Fox, by the way. Something Pico Boulevard, LA. You can find it on the internet. Funny story, I was actually supposed to have a cameo in the film. I'd asked for that, and they agreed. The timing didn't work out, but what was going to happen is they were going to fly me out to Budapest where they were filming, and I was going to appear in the very last battle of the film. And I was going to get my head chopped off by Aragorn on screen, which just seemed so cool to me. The thing I didn't realize when I asked for this, I just wasn't thinking about it, is that in order to have my head chopped off by Aragorn, they would have had to dress me up as one of the monsters, as one of the Urgles. And I think I probably would have made one of the shortest Urgles ever. But who knows? Maybe if there are future movies, you'll still see me get decapitated. So fingers crossed on that one. Who's got another question?
You have written more than one main character, and I have trouble writing more than one main character. And it's kind of hard for me to write more than one, because my friends are
Well, it is tricky. I'm not sure there's a real solution to that. I think the trick to writing more than one character is to treat every single character whose point of view you're writing about as if they're the main character of their story. So you imagine if you have more than one point of view character in a book, then you've got more than one book. So in Eldest, for example, I alternated points of view with Aragorn, Roran, and Nasuada. So I thought about it as 3 separate books, and each book does interrelate, but each book tells its own little story. And then when I think about it that way, it makes it very easy for me. Let's get some questions from around, here in the middle. Well, we've got a couple of hands, so we'll try to get everyone.
Will you be writing any other books based on the Allegasia kind of setting, like the world of Allegasia?
Great question. Well, long answer to a short question. Over the past 10 years, I've thought of about 20 to 30 completely new books that I want to write, and which I've plotted them completely out in all different genres. Fantasy, of course, but also science fiction, mystery, thriller, horror, historical fiction, romance, drama. You name it, I would like to write it. I think I'm going to write science fiction next. I just sort of have to survive this current book tour. I left home April 9th. I get home July 2nd. So, long tour. Long term, I definitely intend to return to the world of Aragorn and write book 5. I already have it named. I already have it outlined. And if you've read book 4, you'll probably notice there are some questions I didn't answer. Well, that's book 5. And the only thing I'll tell you about book 5 is that you're going to learn quite a bit more about the character of Angela the herbalist. And if I say anything more than that, I have to take you all home with me and lock you in my basement for the next few years. And while you seem like perfectly nice people, I don't think my mom wants to have to cook for you for that long. So, another question?
How'd you come up with the other characters other than Angela and Aragorn, and how'd you come up with like Roran and all the other characters?
Oh, a number of different ways. Sometimes I take a little bit of the people I know and sort of build on that. Sometimes I just ask myself questions like, wouldn't it be cool if this or that? Sometimes I would see a painting or a picture and I would like it so much I'd think, oh, what kind of a person is that? And then start writing about that. Basically by being curious about the world around me and trying to use it in interesting ways. Yes, right down here on the front. We'll get the microphone to you.
What inspired you to write a book?
Ooh, what inspired me to write a book? Well, aside from my lack of interest in continuing to dig big holes, I read a book called Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher by Bruce Coville, which is a great book. And it's about a young man in this world who goes into a beat-up old shop and he buys a stone that ends up hatching a dragon. And I loved that idea so much of a young man finding a dragon egg that I started asking myself questions. I said, what sort of a world would a dragon come from? How would a dragon egg end up in the middle of a forest? Who would find it? Why is he there? Who else would be looking for the dragon egg? And just by asking those questions and then by trying to answer them, I ended up with thousands of pages of story, an entire world, hundreds and hundreds of characters, and I spent 14 years on this thing. So, the moral of the story is, quite literally, be careful the questions you ask. You never know what will happen to you. Yes, in the black shirt. Mostly black shirt, I think.
Well, I started reading this when I was like 8, so it's pretty much my entire childhood.
Well, I started writing when I was 15, so not too far off.
I was just wondering, between each book you had quite a long gap. Was that originally intended, or was that just because you weren't happy with either book and you wanted to get it all right?
It was a combination of things. I mean, one, I am a perfectionist, somewhat to my detriment sometimes. So, yes, I spent a lot of time working on it, trying to make it as good as I can. But two, I do a lot of traveling for book tours, which eats up a lot of time, like this current tour. And three, as you might have noticed, the books get longer. And Aragon, for example, has about 160,000 words. Inheritance has about 300,000 words. And the thing is I wrote Inheritance in the same amount of time as I wrote Brissinger, and it's longer. So I actually have become a faster writer. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. No one believes me. My editor doesn't believe me, but that's my story. But actually, I did sort out some things, personal and professional, in the past about 2 years. And my writing has gotten quite a bit faster, and hopefully you guys won't have to wait quite so long to see a new book from me. So we'll see. Let's see. Where's another good question? Yes, over on the right. My right. Oh, over there, back.
When you first saw the covers to your book, did you think they were what you thought of the dragons when you first wrote them?
No. That's not to say, but I liked the covers. Every time you have your work adapted by someone else, it's not the way you would imagine it. And that's not always a bad thing. I like the cover art. I like the artist's work quite a lot. I think that the covers have been very successful for these books. The covers were painted by a man named John Jude Palancar. And the thing is growing up, I was a big fan of art. And so when I wrote Aragon, I named the valley where Aragon grows up Palancar Valley. And I did that as a tribute to Palancar, the artist. Now, Random House did not know that, and they didn't consult me when they chose to have him paint the covers for the books. So it was a great, great coincidence. No, that's not how I see the dragons, but I think they're great paintings, and I think they capture a lot of the feeling of the dragons, which is a lot more important than having someone just do a very literal drawing that has no emotion. Yes. I'm going to make you guys run back and forth, sorry. Down here in the front. I'm going to be rude and just continue to point.
Hi, I'm Aria. I was wondering, what's the process you went through to self-publish?
What was the process? It basically wouldn't work for anyone else, but I'll tell you, because I had my family to support me, and so we all did different jobs. My dad designed the interior of the book. My mom helped pull together the promotional material. I drew the cover. I also drew the map inside the books. The original cover is the dragon eye in the books. My sister helped with all of that and editing and other things. And then we used a print-on-demand company, which was a good way to get the books out without having to print 10,000 of them all at one time. The thing is there were no ebooks available back then and no ebook readers. So if I were to self-publish nowadays, it would be a completely different process. Best advice for you I'd give would be to do a lot of reading on the internet and buy some books about self-publishing and just educate yourself as best you can about the process, because it's changed a lot in the past 10 years. Let's see. Yes?
We know you're a Doctor Who fan. Who's your favourite Doctor?
You know I'm a Doctor Who fan. Who's my favorite Doctor? It's a tie. It's a three-way tie between Tom Baker, Christopher Eccleston, and David Tennant. And I say Christopher Eccleston because he's named Christopher and he's cool. But yes, I am a Doctor Who fan, and as some of you may or may not have noticed, I put some mentions of Doctor Who in both of the last two books. My secret pet theory is actually that Angela is a Time Lord, but... let's see. Yes, on the edge of the aisle there.
Hi, how do you go about creating your own language?
How do you go about creating your own language? You pick a series of sounds that you like, vowels and consonants, even just one word. And then you take the patterns you've created and you start building rules off of them. The grammar can be quite a bit more complicated than that, but that's how you create the sound of a language. There are some great websites devoted to how to create imaginary languages, and it's incredibly... It never ends. If you're really dedicated to it, it never ends. Tolkien spent his whole life pretty much creating the languages for his worlds. And, pretty much just wrote Lord of the Rings as back history for his languages. I'm not quite that obsessive, but there are other people out there who are. So again, there's some great resources on the internet. But mainly it's finding sounds and creating patterns around those sounds. Yes, there was a right on the edge on the aisle again. No, right to your left. Yes.
On the front covers of every book, who are the dragons?
You haven't read the series, have you?
Yeah, I have.
You have? Oh.
I'm just confused.
Well, book 1 is Saphira, book 2 is Thorn, book 3 is Glader, and book 4 is I Shall Not Say. Yes, book 4 is spoiler. Book 4 is spoiler. Let's see. Yes. Up a couple of rows, back 2 rows, in, back another row, sorry. Back another row. Okay, now in. Hold up your hand, yeah. Can you pass that along? It's like playing Battleship. D3, miss. Okay.
What questions did you ask to create the character of Murtagh?
What would happen if someone like Aragorn got raised in an absolutely horrible, horrible situation? How would he or she react? And to a certain degree, how would I react? And assuming that you didn't just turn into a monster right from the get-go. So those were the questions I asked, and his whole character is sort of based around trying to answer that essential conundrum, so to speak. Good question. No one's ever asked me that before. Way in the back by the doors.
How did you come up with the names?
So a couple of different ways. For example, Aragon is dragon, with the first letter changed from D to E. And of course, it also means an era gone by, an era gone, which I thought was nice for the series. Saphira is a play on sapphire, and there are a number of my other names which are also word plays like that. The rest of them come from either historical sources or I invent them according to the according to the rules of my imaginary languages. So it's kind of a mix of things. The trick is trying to find a name that feels right for the character. And of all of them, dragons are the hardest to name. Yes?
Aside from all the Doctor Who references throughout the last 2 books, are there any others in there?
Oh, well, there's a Major Dune reference, there's a Blazing Saddles reference, there's a Star Trek Deep Space Nine reference, there's a reference to the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, there's a reference to throwing stars if you're clever enough to find it. Very obscure reference to throwing stars. Let's see, what else have I referenced? There's a reference to The Prisoner, the old BBC show, which you guys have to see, The Prisoner, if you haven't seen it, which is also a reference to Babylon 5 in a slightly sideways manner. Let's see, what else have I slipped in there? I know I'm forgetting something. Oh, there's more. There's more. And trust me, this is what authors do. We put in lots of little jokes here and there. It keeps us amused. Very few people notice, but it keeps us amused. Down here in the front a little bit more. Anyone who's got their hand up.
Where did you get the idea for Solumbum and the Werecats?
From my sister. She's just one day, she looked at me and she said, wouldn't it be cool if there were werecats? And I said, okay, I'll give you one. And she thought for a moment, she said, you can only use the idea if you tell people it was my idea. And here I am, 10 years later, still telling people that it was my sister's idea. But I'm the one who came up with Solumbum, so, you know, the character of Solumbum. So that's me, not her. Sorry, yes, you had a question down here in the front. We will get the microphone for you. Here. Front row. Well, penultimate row. Yes.
Talking about the names of your characters, this is my daughter, Arya.
I didn't quite catch that earlier.
Which means noble in Sanskrit. Was that part of the inspiration?
It wasn't. I learned that there is the name Arya, and later on, after I published the books, I took it from like the aria of an opera. I spelled it differently, but that's where the thought came from, because I wanted something that was beautiful and strong at the same time. Which, there you go. And now, mind you, George R.R. Martin has an aria in his books in the Game of Thrones, which I didn't know until quite recently. I haven't read the books yet. I know, I will. But I was at Comic-Con with George last year, and we went out to dinner, and I asked him, I said, well, where did you get the name? And he said he wanted a name that sounded strong and fierce and warlike. So I came from a nice, strong song, and he came from a nice, strong warrior. And that we both ended up at the same place. David Eddings also had a character named Arya in The Redemption of Althalis, I believe the name of the book was, though that was published after Aragon, so who knows. Let's see. You've had your arm up for a long time, white shirt. Think so. No, white.
In the series, do you have a favorite book?
Favorite book. Well, if you go by chronology, I'd probably say Aragon, because it was the first book I ever wrote, and I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for it because of that. If you go by weight, then I'd say Inheritance. But if you go by actual quality, then I'd say... again, Inheritance. I think it's the best book I've written, and, you know, writers, we like to think that we're getting better with each book. And I think the best book that I've written is the one I'm working on now. So, and I'll always believe that. If I think that the one I'm working on presently isn't my best book, then I wouldn't be writing it. Good question. Unfortunately, we're running a little short on time here. Let's see. Yes, glasses. You're right in the middle. The passing of the magic wand.
Just wondering, what was your inspiration for the Manoa tree in Tildari Hall?
I have a book about bonsai trees at home. And there is one of the picture of this bonsai fig tree, which I have never seen a tree like this before until I came to Sydney. And it has all these roots coming down from the branches, and it looks very organic and stuff, and that was kind of my inspiration for a lot of the elf stuff. And I think gave the book a little bit of a different feel in those sorts of scenes. Unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap it up for as far as questions go. However, if I wasn't able to answer your question, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have as you're coming up to get your book signed. And I do want to make sure I'm able to sign all of your books. Before we get to that, we're going to have an announcement here on some of the protocol we'll be doing with the signing. But before I go, I just want to say again how much I've enjoyed this. You guys have been awesome. Thank you for reading the books. I hope you enjoy my future ones even more. And if you want to get some news and follow what I'm doing with the writing and other projects, Random House twisted my arm, and I am now on Twitter. My name on Twitter is @InheritanceCP, and I post lots of videos on things on like how to shave Angora rabbits and things like that. as well as news about my writing. And lastly, as Aragon himself would say, Sioner Sverdar Sitya Havas. May your swords stay sharp. Thank you. And